Welcome, everyone. I'm Noah Reed, Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Precision Analytical, creators of the Dutch Test. Thank you all for joining us in this January webinar, and welcome to 2024 with our very own Director of Clinical Education, Dr. Debbie Rice. In this month's presentation, Dr. Rice will explore the interconnection between stress, cortisol, and weight changes. We all know that the holidays can lead to spikes in all of that, so this discussion will bring to light how our body responds to these stressors and how you as providers can understand and best support these challenges. There's even more to discover at dutchtest.com/research. The research team at Dutch recently published a new study that explored the same topic that we're discussing today. They poured through thousands of patient results and found a clinically significant correlation between cortisol metabolites and BMI. Click the link in the chat to read the details of this study and learn more about other peer-reviewed research validating dried urine testing. If you're ready to start using Dutch testing in your practice, sign up as a registered provider today. Click the link that we've posted in the chat and complete our provider application form. A member of our onboarding team will walk you through the steps to set up an account so that you can begin taking advantage of all of the education and resources that Dutch has to offer. Plus, registered providers gain access to the Mastering Functional Hormone Testing course, the Dutch Interpretive Guide, and one-on-one consultations with Dutch clinical educators. This dedicated support and education is designed to help you become the hormone expert. Now, let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Rice is the Director of Clinical Education for Precision Analytical and has focused care on hormone, thyroid, and adrenal health. She has had experience working in communities in need, both in the United States and internationally. Her training is primarily in women's health, pediatric care, midwifery, hormone therapy, and hormone function, as well as complementary adjunct care. Dr. Rice prefers diet and lifestyle, botanical medicine, and conventional approaches to maximize care for her patients. And now, without any further ado, welcome to 2024, and let's get started with today's webinar.
Thank you, Noah. I am honored to be here. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to turn off my camera so I'm not looking at myself, but I have us all in presentation mode, ready to start our adventure today. So as Noah said, we're going to be exploring cortisol and weight gain and the connection between. So just as a reminder, this information is presented for educational purposes only. As always, any questions that you have, please reach out to your provider and work with them to get the best information possible for you. So to start today, we wanted to start up with a big bang and talk about how obesity has become a pandemic. So pandemic means worldwide, right? This is an issue that has put stress on some of the medical systems. We're looking at disease states that can affect our care, the access that we have care to, and quality of life in general. So this map here is actually just for the United States, and this was from 2022. A lot of the risk factors included in obesity include education, poverty level, race, ethnicity, and location. But this is a pretty nice visual to see what we're looking at when we're looking at what obesity means for the United States. And again, this does not include the world numbers. So the WHO states that this is an epidemic across the world of overweight and obesity, naming it Globesity. That is the World Health Organization. There's a differentiation that males have higher risk of being overweight, while females have higher risk of obesity. This is not just for Western and developed countries. This includes developing countries as well. Because of this, we see the risk for diseases which include diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, including stroke, cancer, and more. So contributing factors and considerations. So when evaluating, like, how did we get here? What put us into this position? We want to consider increased stress of a connected society and economy. We are on 24/7, right? We have access to everything, anything, all the time, anywhere. We have increased pressure to perform for work. The other thing that I would also like to put in here is that with our, like, we're so connected, but we're also not connected. We don't have the same kind of like village aspect of living with people and being close to people and having those social connections, even though we are so interconnected. So there is a little bit of separation with social like release, being able to hang out with people. So there's like the capacity for doing stuff online is fantastic, but when we're in a remote community, it can be difficult to feel that connection, and that can also be stressful. When we have these types of stress, it can deprioritize our healthy habits, right? Whole food nutrition gets deprioritized. We're looking at fast food instead. We're looking at processed foods instead. Physical activity is deprioritized. A lot of us are more sedentary, and they do say that sedentary is the new smoking. Doesn't sound great. Inappropriate sleep habits. So if we have work deadlines or family dynamics that can throw off our sleep patterns. So when we think about increased stress, we also want to think about cortisol. Cortisol is our main stress hormone. So how does cortisol tie into weight and obesity? Well, folks, sit back and relax. I will be your tour guide through this awesomely complex yet straightforward discussion. So we do want to look at cortisol and where does cortisol come from? What does it do? Our adrenal glands are where cortisol is produced. It is produced in the adrenal cortex and the zona fasciculata. We do have some other hormones that are involved in our stress response, but we're mainly going to talk about cortisol today, touch a little bit on some catecholamines. So cortisol is produced in the zona fasciculata in the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands. It is a glucocorticoid. That means it is a steroid hormone that utilizes sugar and fats to mediate a response. It can influence immune response and reduce inflammation. Cortisol is also released in response to stress. It's released in the presence of low blood sugar as well, which is also considered a stressor. So because cortisol is a glucocorticoid, it uses glucose for its actions. So we're going to talk about this a couple of times because we need to understand the effect that cortisol has with glucose. So cortisol blocks insulin to keep glucose in the bloodstream. When insulin is released, it gathers up glucose from the bloodstream and puts it into cells so our cells can use it. Cortisol induces gluconeogenesis. This is the breakdown of glucose from fat cells in liver. It reduces protein uptake, so it diverts to gluconeogenesis to keep that glucose in circulation so we can get fuel to do what we need to do. It also suppresses the immune system to deal with whatever stress is happening, right? If you are running from a saber-toothed tiger, you do not have time to get sick. This is also when people, finally get a vacation and they finally relax and then they get sick, right? That's because cortisol is keeping you up and ready, running from your saber-toothed tiger. Cortisol increases blood pressure acutely and also chronically, and it improves focus, mental and physical focus. It improves your eyesight and hearing, right? You need to be able to see, you need to be able to focus on what that stressor is. As a glucocorticoid, cortisol influences the metabolism of glucose, fats, and proteins. The properties of cortisol as a glucocorticoid include being anti-inflammatory, anti-allergic, immunosuppressive, and it does support metabolic optimization. Like when we think of cortisol as a glucocorticoid, think about this. When you are inflamed or when we have certain inflammatory issues that come about, certain doctors might put you on a glucocorticoid, right? It has the same action as cortisol does. So cortisol in that initial phase has that anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive response. So the goal of cortisol is to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is that balance, make sure that we maintain balance. Cortisol creates a state of hyperglycemia, keeping glucose in the bloodstream. The stress-induced need for glucose for critical organs. So when we're looking at like how your brain needs to function, how your skeletal muscles need to do what they need to do, burst, run, we need to have glucose available for that. Again, cortisol blocks insulin action on the cells to keep glucose in the bloodstream. So we have higher glucose in the bloodstream. And it increases the enzymes responsible for that glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis that we talked about previously. It induces catabolism in peripheral muscle to mobilize amino acids for gluconeogenesis. So this is utilizing all of the things that we have to create quick energy, fast energy. And it activates hormone-sensitive lipase to promote beta oxidation of free fatty acids for glucose. What this means is it helps to break down fatty acids to create energy. So the short-term effect of cortisol release is anti-inflammatory and to have the ability to have the energy to fight and deal with the stress. This means we have increased focus, increased blood pressure, and increased heart rate and blood flow to muscles, right? Our systems open up, we're ready to do stuff. This activates that sympathetic nervous system. It decreases your digestive effort. We're not going to be sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner while running from our saber-toothed tiger. It decreases sex hormone response. Not time for sexy time. We're running from a saber-toothed tiger. And it decreases your immune response, right? So we don't get sick so that we can run from our saber-toothed tiger. This part, that decreased digestive effort, means that we are reducing that parasympathetic nervous system support, right? As the sympathetic nervous system fires up, it decreases the parasympathetic nervous system response. So cortisol's short-term purpose is to keep you safe, to enable you to run from your saber-toothed tiger, whatever your saber-toothed tiger may look like. This could be work stress, relationship stress, exercise is also a form of stress, blood sugar dysregulation, not sleeping well. There are many things that can show up as stressors to your body. The long-term effect of cortisol. So long-term effects of cortisol release include, and this is where we're used to having that acute response, right? Like when we were hunters and gatherers, that would be what would keep us alive, right? We would have that increased burst of cortisol, keep us safe. What has happened now is we end up having that longer term effect of cortisol release, right? So we have blood sugar irregularities and dysglycemia. This can lead to diabetes and insulin dysregulation. You have weight gain, specifically around the middle. Immune suppression and immune dysregulation. This means you can get sick easier or more difficult to recover. Chronic fatigue. Gastrointestinal issues or stomach issues. This is parasympathetic nervous system suppression that we just talked about. Constipation, diarrhea, heartburn, stomach upset. Like your gut is just not doing what it's supposed to do because why? You're still fighting against that saber-toothed tiger. Cardiovascular concerns, including blood vessel constriction. This can lead to overcompensation of the cardiovascular system. So high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. And then sex hormone imbalances, we can see infertility, irregular periods, heavy periods, low libido, low sex drive. And those are the things that can happen as your body continues to kind of build into that chronic cortisol response. So for today, we're really going to focus in on that blood sugar irregularity, dysglycemia, and weight gain, specifically around the middle. So just as a reminder, when we look at how cortisol works, we have a stressor that when we get this stressor, our brain has to make a decision on what we're going to do and how we're going to respond to this stress. This is part of that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right? So the hypothalamus signals our CRH in the paraventricular nucleus. The CRH signals the pituitary gland to release ACTH. ACTH then sends signals to your adrenal glands to release cortisol. The really final line here is the more ACTH you have coming from the brain, the more cortisol is released. The less ACTH, the less cortisol is released. But this is also something that starts in the brain, right? So part of that stress response ends up being that fight or flight response. And what I like about this presentation is we can see the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system. So this is where we see those catecholamines. Those catecholamines are epinephrine and norepinephrine. That is your really quick response to stress. That's like if you touch a hot burner, that sympathetic nervous system response is fast. The other signaling that happens with the hypothalamus is where we see that cascade from the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis with the ACTH to the cortisol. So we see the hypothalamus sending signals to the sympathetic nervous system and through that HPA axis for that stress response. So we all know that stress contributes to or exacerbates disease states. We know that cortisol is commonly or frequently referred to as the stress hormone. We also know that our stress response involves our catecholamines. That's epinephrine and norepinephrine, as well as dopamine. Therefore, we can connect that cortisol and our catecholamines influence disease states. We need to understand that the stress response begins in the brain, not the adrenal glands. It's not like the adrenal glands decide that they're going to be stressed. The brain is what decides that we're going to have that stress response. So the brain signals to the adrenal glands for a cortisol response. The brain signals to the nervous system for a catecholamine response. So the brain is making these decisions, right? And this is where your brain has that influence on how we intake stress, right? So is it a perceived stress and how we perceive that stress? So there's a big difference between and every person is a little bit different in how they respond to stress. Some people, their perception of stress is not huge, so they're probably not going to have the same kind of stress response versus the other person who perceive stress as being very overwhelming, that's going to have a different type of stress response there. But again, it's all about the brain and the brain deciding how we're going to respond to that stress. So I actually really love this representation. When we look at this, the stress picture here shows our perceived stress and what that stress effect can have, right? And influences our disease state. So we have perceived stress, which can influence our mental, emotional regulation. We have blood sugar imbalance or that glycemic dysregulation. Ultimately, insulin resistance and obesity is what that end product is, right? We have inflammation, we have inflammatory signals, and ultimately this inflammation can lead to obesity. We also have circadian disruption. So when our HPA axis is not functioning as well as it could, we can also see circadian rhythm disruption. And that is important when we're looking at HPA balance or imbalance. So to hone in here, we can see like two of the big, actually 50% of this presentation is looking at glycemic dysregulation. So that's blood sugar dysregulation. And that's looking at dietary choices, meal timing, stress eating, and the different things that can happen when we continue down that path, right? The end result can be obesity. Inflammatory signals. These are highlighted in the little black boxes there, the IL-1 beta, the IL-6, the TNF alpha. So these inflammatory signals continue to compound and compound. The more inflammation we have, we can see disease states with cardiovascular disease, joint and bone issues, and then GI inflammation. And what can happen there is when your body's not feeling good, you don't want to move, low physical activity. That also means your metabolism slows down. That can also lead to obesity. So this is where we're highlighting that even 50% of this picture, when we look at that glycemic dysregulation, those inflammatory signals, what is that overall overarching result? We have obesity, right? Low physical activity. And these are because of those two things, right? Glycemic, food, diet choices, meal timing, and inflammatory diseases that can show up where your body's just not comfortable in moving as well as it could. So the other part that we want to look at here is circadian disruption. So our body is very dependent on how the circadian rhythm runs. And when we don't have good circadian rhythm, when we don't have good sleep and sleep patterns, this can negatively affect how our body responds to sleep, our capacity to deal with stress. And we also know that during sleep hours is when our body is repairing. Our sleepy time is repair time, right? Our wakeful time is when our body just destroys all of its cells, which it's supposed to do. It's like anything that's functioning, everything gets messy, but then closing time, everything gets cleaned. That's the same thing when we're talking about sleep and circadian rhythm. So cortisol responds to sunlight, right? All of our cells actually respond to sunlight. It's a huge factor in supporting our circadian rhythm, that wakefulness and sleepiness. So that sunlight determines our wakefulness and sleepiness. We should be wakeful during the light and sleepy during the night. So hormones that regulate metabolism include growth hormone, cortisol, leptin, ghrelin, thyroid, estradiol, testosterone, DHEA, progesterone. There are more, but this is a pretty good list that looks at hormones that can help regulate our metabolism. The ones that we are going to look at today are going to be a little bit of growth hormone, cortisol, leptin, ghrelin, and some other cells that can influence our metabolism. So these hormones also require a healthy sleep pattern to do their jobs appropriately. When there's sleep deprivation, these hormones are unable to work as optimally as they could. So sleep and metabolism. We know that sleep is an important contributor to overall health. Sleep is integral to our circadian modulation, making sure that we have that sleepiness and wakefulness. And when sleep loss occurs, we are susceptible to increased disease states, disrupted metabolism, and confused hormone signaling, right? So our hormones may still signal, but they might not signal appropriately. They might not signal at the amplitude that they need to. So you're still not getting a good representation of how those hormones should be working. So I did want to highlight here sleep and sex differences. So the key points of this little blurb here show that females are at higher risk for inflammatory disease. Females are more likely to have sleep issues, and they are more likely to develop higher levels of systemic inflammation associated with sleep loss. We also see the higher levels of CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, and IL-6 with females and inflammation. So really what we see from this is that females have a higher risk of inflammation. They have higher reactivity to sleep disturbances. This does touch on ethnic differences too, but it needs more data collection here, which is why I did not highlight that. So sleep deprivation and inflammatory markers. You guys, this is just good information to have. Like I know that this is small, and if you can see this is actually pretty impressive. And for those patients that try to kid themselves, if we do, and providers, I'll be guilty to this. If we try to pretend like we're getting enough sleep and we're doing all the right things, we can test this in our blood, right? Like there are markers that we can look at. If we look at this, so this is looking at sleep deprivation of 88 hours. We're going to see increased levels of TNF-R1. So we see increased levels of IL-6. We see increased levels of IL-10. We see progressive increases in C-reactive protein. If we have sleep deprivation of 34 hours, we start to see increased levels of TNF, but not the TNF-R2. We also see IL-6 and CRP. So we can see, like, based on your sleep deprivation, we can see these inflammatory markers continue to increase, right? So let's see, the sleep deprivation for 7 nights, we have increased levels of IL-6 in both sexes, an increased level of TNF in men, but not women. So this is a really great chart to kind of compare if you decide to check in on your patients or yourself. You can see, hey, if I were to test these levels, what is that going to look like? If I know that I'm getting good sleep, these are the things that I would expect to not affect me, right? These are the things that should not negatively affect me. But this is just great information to have to be able to check in on, are you sleep deprived? What does that look like? Based on your levels, what is your body telling us? Right? Sleep deprivation is also different per person, right? Some people feel well rested after 6 hours of sleep. Most in general, when we look at sleep patterns, 7 to 9 hours is optimal. So there are some people that may have chronic sleep deprivation, but don't know it because you're getting 6 hours of sleep a night. So this is a good way to check in on that too. So sleep and disease risk. So when we look at your sleep needs, appropriate sleep patterning, that circadian rhythm. When sleep deprivation is present, we see difficulty losing weight, easy to gain weight, imbalanced signaling for ghrelin and leptin, inappropriate cortisol signaling, right? Because cortisol is our daytime hormone, cognitive aging, biologic aging, so brain aging and then body aging, depression and mood shifts, and poor metabolic resiliency, meaning your body can't bounce back, right? So depending on how that sleep deprivation looks, the lesser your sleep deprivation, the better your body can get back in sync with appropriate hormone signaling. The longer you have that sleep deprivation, the more difficult it is for your body to bounce back into that regular or optimal hormone signaling. So hormones involved in weight management, we have leptin, ghrelin, adiponectin, and cortisol. There are others, but these are going to be our focus for today. So hormones released from fat cells. We have fat cells that release hormones, and I want to take a look at how these fat cells communicate. So fat cells are also called adipocytes. So we look at adipocyte physiology. Previously, we thought that fat or adipocytes, the fat cells, were an inert storage organ. So we used to think it just didn't really do anything, that it could be more of like a barrier, protective. But what we found out is that adipose tissue really is its own endocrine organ. This means it's capable of secreting biologically active components, which are called adipokines. So adipokines are biologically active, meaning they are metabolically active. When we think of being metabolically active, that means they influence your metabolism. These are called adipokines. So an adipocyte plus a cytokine equals an adipokine. So an adipokine is a cell signaler that comes from your fat tissue. Adipokines affect metabolic signaling and manage hormones affecting appetite, satiety, glucose metabolism, lipid or fatty acid metabolism, inflammation, and immune function. Cytokines work through cellular activity. So they signal cellular activity. And these can include pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory signals. We have two major classes of adipose tissue. We have white adipose tissue, or WAT, and we have brown adipose tissue, or BAT. WAT, BAT, WAT, BAT. So when we look at different fat cells in the body, the white adipose tissue stores excess energy as triglycerides, and the adipokines generally released from white adipose tissue are adiponectin, leptin, and IL-6. There's actually a really huge list of what the white adipose tissue releases as adipokines, but these are the major ones that we're going to kind of talk through today. The brown adipose tissue actually stores energy as small lipid droplets. It is metabolically active and it is thermogenic. The adipokines released from brown adipose tissue are IL-6, IL-8, and IL-10. IL is interleukin. So the adipokines released by your white adipose tissue and your brown adipose tissue modulate thermogenesis, energy expenditure, glucose homeostasis, lipid metabolism, insulin sensitivity, angiogenesis, and inflammation. So let's talk about leptin. With leptin function, when we look at leptin, this is produced from our white adipose tissue mass. So any of the white adipose tissue that we have produced, that's where our leptin comes from. The function of leptin is to suppress hunger, stimulate satiety, so it regulates our appetite, and increases energy expenditure through fatty acid oxidation. That fatty acid oxidation is utilizing those fat cells to give us energy. It results in decreased fat mass in the adipocyte, and it strongly influences our immune cells, more specifically that T cell, T helper 1 response. And it is released in a diurnal and pulsatile fashion. The levels of leptin are highest in the evening and early morning hours, and circulating levels of leptin represent the amount of energy stored in fat. So low levels of fat equal low levels of leptin. And just as an aside here, one of the things that I was looking at, because I think this has been, I don't know if you guys have had this question, but I come across this question just myself and with patients, is when we look at fat cells, right? Because these fat cells are metabolically active and become kind of their own endocrine organ. The question is, does your body create more fat cells, or do you have that same number of fat cells through most of your life? And what we have found is that your body essentially creates all of its fat cells in your adolescence. So by the time you are in your 20s, you have the amount of fat cells that you are going to have. Now, the difference with fat cells is how big they are or how little they are. So when we look at the fat cell volume, like when we're looking at this, leptin results in decreased fat mass of the adipocyte. So you still have the same number of fat cells, but it can reduce how big or what their mass looks like. So that's an important component of leptin. Adiponectin. So when we look at adiponectin function, this is also produced by white adipose tissue. It increases fatty acid oxidation, so it burns fat for energy, and it sensitizes our insulin. So the important thing about adiponectin is it really helps insulin stay sensitized so that we can have appropriate blood sugar management. It is strongly anti-inflammatory. And when we look at this, high levels of adiponectin are generally better. So in the graphic here, we're looking at the functions of adiponectin in the adipocytes in the liver, in the pancreas, in the muscle, and in the adipocytes. So we can see that high levels of adiponectin in adipocytes can help in consumption of glucose and help to metabolize your triglycerides and help send out fat storage function for the adipocytes. So other components of function for adiponectin is it's anti-atherosclerotic, which is really exciting when we think about that. So that helps with our blood vessels, right? So how much inflammation can develop when we're looking at blood vessel health. It is anti-proliferative, and it can suppress carcinogens. So adiponectin not only influences our metabolism of fats and fatty acids and energy balance, but it also has some pretty significant effects when we talk about blood vessel health, when we talk about proliferation of cells and suppressing carcinogens, right? So this is also where we're looking at cancer development. what those signals mean. So adiponectin function is actually really important when we look at immune function too. It does help modulate immune function by affecting both B and T cells. So it's got a pretty heavy immune hit here. And adiponectin levels are decreased in disease states like type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, obesity, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. So remember, high levels of adiponectin are better. The more adiponectin we have, the more protective it is, the more it can help support insulin signaling and sensitization. The lower levels of adiponectin are where we have more risk for disease. So ghrelin is another one of our adipokines, and this is actually one of the adipokines that comes from our gut, and it I like to call ghrelin the gremlin hormone. Because if you think about gremlins, if you guys have ever watched Gremlins, they're all about eating, especially after midnight, right? Like all of the bad things that you're not supposed to do with eating. So ghrelin to me is the gremlin hormone. That's how I remember it. Ghrelin stimulates appetite. It stimulates fat deposition. It stimulates the release of growth hormone. So this is where we're building, right? Like we're trying to pile on some things. We're trying to get more food. We're trying to get more calories. We want to get that fat deposition. It inhibits insulin secretion. So it keeps that glucose in your bloodstream. It regulates hepatic or liver glucose output. It decreases energy expenditure. So it makes your body less desire to move. It reduces thermogenesis, so it reduces heat, right? And heat can help burn energy. When we reduce that thermogenesis, you have more of a sedentary presentation. Ghrelin is often called the hunger hormone, and it's necessary for blood glucose balance. So when we're looking at ghrelin, this is one of the things that can really come up in like malnutrition and fasting states for too long. So ghrelin is there to protect you, actually, because it wants to make sure that you're getting all of the calories that you need, that you're getting your fat deposition for energy. You're getting your fat deposition so that you have thermogenesis and thermoregulation. And it is that balancer of just like the adiponectin and the leptin help to keep those blood sugar levels low. Ghrelin can help balance that to make sure that you don't drop too low. The other parts of ghrelin are that it reduces sympathetic nerve activity and prevents muscle atrophy. So the reason I put these in here is because ghrelin in the research is also actually pretty cool in that because it can help prevent muscle atrophy, ghrelin actually comes in certain disease states like myocardial infarction or a heart attack. If that happens, ghrelin actually kicks in. It reduces sympathetic nerve activity so that you're not having that sympathetic reaction in those cells. And it prevents muscle atrophy, meaning your muscle can stay strong and healthy. So ghrelin is pretty awesome. I feel like a lot of people think that ghrelin is bad because it is the hunger hormone, but it's actually really protective. Its important factors are that it helps to balance that blood sugar for you, so you're not becoming malnourished. You're not losing muscle when you are having reduced appetite and trying to balance that blood sugar for you. It can contribute to obesity and insulin resistance if there's too much of it, right? Again, all of these are like Goldilocks hormones, right? We don't want too little. We don't want too much. We want just the right amount. And that's the important thing, because every person has an individual metabolism. Every person has an individual stress response. Every person is individual. And we need to remember that when we're looking at what's happening with their adiponectin, what's happening with their leptin, what's happening with their ghrelin. It's involved in bone metabolism and formation, and it may be indicated in cancer. It can have proliferative properties. So because ghrelin is really in that, like, we're going to build stuff, we're going to pile stuff on, it can maybe get excited where it shouldn't. One of the big things that's involved in cancer development is the VEGF, the VEGF. And this is like a whole other lecture for another time, but this can be contributory because it's proliferative, and ghrelin is one of the main drivers for that as well. So again, all in balance. So the adipocyte effect on the body. So what we see here, and this doesn't include all of those adipokines that we have talked about, but we can see the different effects on the systems of the body, right? We're looking at appetite. So we're looking at leptin and adiponectin. Those are the ones that we've talked about so far. Insulin secretion. So how much insulin is secreted? We want to be able to manage. Are we getting too much insulin out there, or are we holding insulin back? And that's also looking at leptin and adiponectin. Steatosis or liver function. So the liver is going to be important when we're looking at overall metabolism of our fats and sugars. And our adipocytes, the adipokines influence that signaling. And when we have too much inflammation happening with the liver, we can see a compromise in how well the liver is able to support metabolism. And it can affect how well those adipokines can signal all of what they're supposed to be doing, right? Are we supporting inflammation? Are we going pro-inflammatory? Are we anti-inflammatory? Atherogenesis. So this is looking at blood vessel health and inflammation. So we already talked a little bit about that with leptin and adiponectin, and how this can affect your blood vessel health and where those, fats are deposited and how our body signals our fat release and use of that energy. We also see insulin sensitivity. So not just insulin secretion, but how well our body is responding to insulin, right? So when we look at other peripheral tissues like muscle, are they sensitive enough to insulin? Are they getting the glucose that they need? We want to make sure that we are having appropriate receptor sensitivity so that our bodies are signaling appropriately. And then adipocytes and adipokines effect on the body. So I really liked this representation because we can see the anti-inflammatory effect and pro-inflammatory effect of these different adipokines. So when we have better functioning adipokines, we have leaner fat cells or lower mass fat cells. And this leads to lower probability of pathogenesis, meaning lower risk of metabolic and cardiovascular disease. When that's flipped and we have lower levels of anti-inflammatory and higher levels of pro-inflammatory, this means those fat cells can increase their mass. When we have increased fat cells, we have more signaling that can increase inflammation, and we have a higher probability of pathogenesis, meaning we have higher chance for metabolic and cardiovascular disease. Okay, so adipokines in general, their goal is to maintain metabolic integrity or homeostasis through sensitization or resistance to insulin, or essentially regulating blood glucose levels, right? Like that's their goal in general. They influence immune function, they influence inflammation, but it's all because they want to help regulate that blood glucose level. So this is a quote taken from a study. Adipose tissue inflammation is initiated and sustained over time by aberrant adipocytes, so bad adipocytes that secrete inflammatory adipokines, and by the invasion of immune cells formed in the bone marrow that communicate via the production of cytokines and chemokines. Low-grade inflammation of adipose tissue has a detrimental effect on distant organ function and is believed to be the core cause of obesity complications. Among them, visceral obesity plays an essential role in the development of metabolic syndrome. So this is a pretty big statement, right? So when we're looking at adipose tissue inflammation, that's because it's initiated and sustained because those adipocytes were not doing what they were supposed to do. And this can come from many different reasons, sometimes illness, sometimes stress, but that tells us that the adipocytes end up getting a little wonky, right? So that wonky adipocyte signaling ends up sustaining inflammatory response. And because of that, that's where we start to see the complications in obesity. So why is this all important? Let's try to pull all of this together now. So key points when we're looking at cortisol, cortisol is released in response to a stress. Cortisol is meant to be acutely protective, right? We were not meant to be running from a saber-tooth tiger all the time, every day, forever and ever and ever. It is not meant to maintain chronically high levels. When your body is in fight or flight mode, your appetite decreases, tissue repair stops, reproduction processes slow, hormones slow down, and your immune system pauses. When your cortisol levels remain consistently high, the body craves carbohydrates and sugars for energy and high fats. Your sleep is not optimal. Even if you're sleeping in like the same amount of time, like you're still going to bed at the same time, you're still waking up at the same time, there are studies that show that even with that, the sleep quality is less. So you're not getting as good quality of sleep. With this, when cortisol levels remain consistently high, your energy expenditure becomes less. And your appetite changes, meaning the timing of eating and the type of food eaten. So when we have sustained high levels of cortisol, we have that need for comfort food. So a lot of times we see this. Your body starts to crave high fats, foods with high glycemic index. The reason for that is because your brain runs better on glucose and sucrose for energy. The other thing that our body kind of protectively does is when we have higher levels of carbohydrates, our body has to release insulin. And so your body knows that when it's in a high stress situation for a longer amount of time, if you feed it carbohydrates, it's going to release insulin. And the hope with that is it will reduce cortisol. So these should have that balancing effect on each other. And that's what the body's trying to do, right? It gives you that craving for high fats and high glycemic foods so that you can increase your appetite, release that insulin, and then lower that cortisol. That's what's supposed to happen in balanced signaling. With poor diurnal regulation, hormone signaling becomes imbalanced, right? So ghrelin, leptin, and adiponectin may not be signaling appropriately. And the timing of food intake is different. Your body distributes these calories differently. This combination causes your white adipose tissue to redistribute to the abdominal region of the body, and you now have increased adipokine activity from your white adipose tissue. This abdominal white adipose tissue actually decreases the activity of your brown adipose tissue. So that means we have decreased thermogenesis and decreased protective properties, right? It's less anti-inflammatory. So now you're pro-inflammatory. Cortisol reduces the ability to focus and think clearly. When this occurs, we do not make smart food choices. Rather, we follow our cravings for high glycemic carbohydrates and fats. Now, part of that is your body trying to get you back into balance. But the other part of that, depending on how long this has been happening for, is your diurnal rhythm, your diurnal curve may also be off. When we're eating well, we tend to have less cravings, right? So we may not consider the timing of when we eat either when we're stressed, right? Like if you are stressed, something is happening, you realize, good golly, it's 5 o'clock in the evening and I haven't eaten anything. So now your body has been in a type of state, sometimes fasting, sometimes too long. And then you end up eating or overeating. And because you're all of a sudden hungry, again, smart food choices may not be happening. When we are stressed, we don't create space for physical activity, which also creates metabolic imbalance, right? So when you're stressed, you're working on a deadline, you are traveling, you are dealing with family dynamics, you're not going to pause and say, I'm just going to go do some yoga really quick, or I'm just going to go to my Orange Theory, right? When you are thrown out of routine, your body doesn't have a good routine. And so then you end up just doing things randomly or when you can, or however you're able to. Our bodies really like routine. I know I've said this before. If you've been a patient of mine, you've heard this. If you've listened to me speak before, you hear me say this. Our bodies like routine. Our bodies and our adrenal glands too, think cortisol, are like a puppy. What we know about puppies is they do awesome with routine, right? Like they know when it's bedtime, they know when it's time to wake up, they know it's time to go for their walk, they know when it's dinner time. They like routine, they do better on routine. Same thing. Our adrenal glands like a puppy. It's not just about calories in equals calories out, right? That is no longer it. Multiple studies show that sustained high levels of cortisol correlate with a high BMI. Elevated cortisol metabolites, that's our THF and our THE, correlate with high BMI. And when we're looking at BMI, even though there could be some discussion about how BMI is measured, BMI is highly correlated with, higher BMI is correlated with obesity. Still, other studies have shown that sustained high levels of cortisol predict obesity in multiple populations. So they can see this in children and adults, multiple ethnicities. When they look at high levels of cortisol, they can predict obesity. And cortisol can further metabolize from fat cells via cortisol conversion enzymes. So the more white adipose tissue you have, and the more stress that's happening, you end up getting this kind of build up like this vicious cycle where cortisol continues to convert to more cortisol to more cortisol. So then you get this higher cortisol and you're just feeding that cortisol loop. Right. And in this, I want to be sure to highlight that the elevated cortisol metabolites show that this is about how your body metabolizes cortisol, not how your body produces cortisol. So that is a big distinction when we're looking at cortisol, BMI, and obesity. And as Noah said at the beginning of the presentation, we do have information on this. We just recently published this in December. This has a pretty extensive review of cortisol metabolites and the correlation with higher BMI. So please check that out. This, I think, is a wonderful picture or representation of that vicious cycle that can happen, because sometimes it's not about you started out obese and then these things happen. Sometimes it starts out that you are stressed and these things happen. So this is that circle of stress, obesity, and glucocorticoid reactivity. That GC is glucocorticoid. So the other thing that I want to highlight here is that glucocorticoid reactivity is dependent on receptor sensitivity. So they have acknowledged in studies that different people have different reactivity. So certain disease states and even mental states can influence how sensitized your glucocorticoid receptors are. So the more highly sensitized they are, the more reactive they can be, and vice versa. The less sensitized they are, the less reactive they can be. So when we look at this and we can see like with the different colors and the how dark the colors are, and when we're looking at this relationship. So if we have chronic stress and we look at that outside circle, chronic stress can lead to obesity, which can lead to increased glucocorticoid reaction. When we have increased glucocorticoid reaction, that can increase stress, and vice versa, right? If we have chronic stress, really what ends up happening is we have increased sensitization of our glucocorticoid reactions or receptors, and that can stimulate that obesity response, and then that obesity ends up causing stress to the system. So you have this ongoing vicious cycle. And what I love about this is it also shows us individual characteristics, right? So we want to take into consideration your genetics, right? Like we can certainly tip our hat to genetics and how our body signals different things, either pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, and even immunomodulating. So we also have genes that are obesity related. Some people have this gift and some people do not. We have physical disorders, right? Chronic pain, endocrine diseases, cardiovascular disease, obstructive sleep apnea. We have certain intoxication, so excessive alcohol use, smoking. That can be really stressful on our cells and our cellular function. Unhealthy lifestyles, sleep deprivation, shift work, unhealthy food choices, lack of exercise, mental distress, mood and anxiety disorders. I would say that a lot of the studies in looking at this did a pretty good review of mental health. And what they really focused on was mood and anxiety disorders. And weight discrimination. This actually comes up pretty significantly for how that affects your stress response. And then medication use. So corticosteroids are a big one. Antipsychotics, antidepressants, and beta blockers can also influence how well your body has that glucocorticoid reactivity and what that means for stress on your body. So this is complicated, but not, right? Like when we look at it, like when we read through all of the things, it makes sense. So cortisol and weight gain considerations. Not all cases of weight gain have high cortisol levels. So we have normocortisolistic obesity, which means you have normal metabolic levels of cortisol. So that metabolized cortisol is within the normal range. This means there are likely other factors influencing your metabolism, and it's not just about cortisol. This that we're talking about today is more of that hypercortisolistic obesity. So these are elevated cortisol levels in that metabolized cortisol. So many times this is also associated with abnormal body composition, poor diurnal pattern, insulin dysregulation, and inflammatory states. So other considerations, people who are overweight or obese and are mentally stressed about weight discrimination show higher cortisol levels. So the people that are overweight and obese but are not stressed about it show lower cortisol levels, interestingly enough. And this correlates to ongoing elevated cortisol levels that perpetuate cortisol with weight gain, right? So this is really kind of like feeding on itself, essentially. When you are overweight and obese and are mentally stressed about it, you continue to create that higher cortisol cycle. So when we look at treatment considerations, so when elevated cortisol is involved, it's important to consider, and really what we're looking at and considering these are those foundational lifestyle things. Stress management. I know it's easy to say, we'll throw it out there like fairy dust. But yes, even the studies say it, mindfulness, prayer. Studies show that it makes a huge difference. A lot easier said than done, but the proof is in the pudding. Stress management, mindfulness, breath work, and adopting an appropriate sleep routine. So making sure that you have an appropriate circadian rhythm, right? That you're going to bed around the same time every night, you're waking up around the same time every morning. That's going to be huge in supporting your sleep, the sleep cycle, and that sleep architecture that supports better hormone signaling, right? Making sure that your growth hormone can do what it's supposed to do. Make sure your leptin is signaling appropriately. And then stabilizing blood sugar. So timing and quality of nutrients is key. It's not just about what you eat, it's also about when you eat. So when the body has higher elevated cortisol, protein and balanced foods every 2 to 4 hours when stressed can help to maintain stable blood sugar and reduce cravings for those high glycemic foods. And this is something where you just have to kind of proactively get into that pattern. When elevated cortisol is involved, we also want to look at physical activity. So walking, cardiovascular, movement, getting the blood pumping, walking for 20 minutes, especially post meal. So there's a lot of research that is supportive of going for a walk 20 minutes after you eat, or for 20 minutes after you eat. That can also help to lower your blood sugar. Weightlifting to support healthy muscle metabolism. The more muscle mass you have, the better metabolism you have, right? Like muscles are also essentially their own endocrine organ. And the lack of muscle or lack of protein can also create increased fat mass. So we want to be aware of that. And then food planning. I know like when you are stressed out, the last thing you want to do is plan out your food. But honestly, it is the best way to get ahead of falling into those really bad patterns. So this reduces the stress of having to decide on foods in the moment of stress, because if you're me, I'm going to have cheesecake. Can I have dairy? No, I don't care. I want cheesecake, right? But if I plan ahead, I'm going to make better decisions. This is proven to reduce snacking, poor food choices, and craving frenzies. So we also want to make sure that we're addressing the root cause, right? Like, are there mood issues that need to be addressed when we're looking at anxiety and depression? Are there immune issues that need to be addressed? Are there viral issues, microbial issues? There's a lot of connection with our gut health and overall immune function and disease states in general, but we want to evaluate immune function in general and inflammation in general, right? Do we have environmental exposures? Are there foods that we shouldn't be eating? Is there mold in the house? Have we been, with other viral things too? Have we been exposed to Lyme? Like, we want to be able to take the whole kit and caboodle out and look at it and say like, okay, this is good, this is good, this is not good. We need to work on this, right? Being able to address the root cause is going to be important. And test, don't guess. It's important to have information to approach your treatment appropriately. You can do serum testing for leptin, adiponectin, and other inflammatory markers. You guys saw that fun little sheet. Guys, I can't wait to do that test on me, actually. But you can do that in the blood. And then Dutch testing, of course, right? We want to look at metabolized cortisol. So how is our body metabolizing cortisol? Not producing cortisol, but metabolizing cortisol. We want to look at those cortisol metabolites, that THF and the THE. We want to be able to see our diurnal pattern of free cortisol to evaluate appropriate circadian rhythm. Are we on par with that circadian rhythm? Do we have the daytime, nighttime balance? The 8-hydroxy marker looks at oxidative stress. So this is looking at cellular stress or DNA damage. And we can also look at inflammatory markers in our kynurenate, the xanthionate, and the quinolinate. So these give us a really good idea of like where we're at. Do we have good metabolized cortisol? Do we have a good diurnal pattern? What does that inflammation look like? Okay, and I don't know if we have time for questions, but thank you for joining me in our adventure today.
Yes, we don't have time for questions. However, we do want to thank everybody for joining us today for the webinar, and check your inboxes tomorrow for a link to the recording and to access all the resources that we shared today. You can learn more about the research behind Dutch Test at dutchtest.com/research, and make sure to visit the Become a Provider tab at dutchtest.com to register for an account so that you can gain access to even more hormone education and research. Again, thanks for coming. Have a great rest of your day.